In the first part of 2024, several water treatment plants in western Pennsylvania in the United States underwent an unusual cyber attack. To better understand what made this unusual, we actually have to go back to October 7th, 2023. That's when Hamas forces attacked a rock concert being enjoyed by hundreds of Israeli citizens in Gaza. In the following months, the conflict in Gaza would result in thousands of innocent Palestinians and Israeli citizens dying in various military attacks. So what does this conflict almost 6,000 miles away have to do with rural Pennsylvania? Here's David Muir and Pierre Thomas from ABC World News Tonight.
In the U.S., a new bulletin tonight amid this Israeli war. Tonight, there is new concern that Iranian-backed hackers might have targeted the water supply system near Pittsburgh. The ominous message sent about using equipment made by Israel. Here's our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, now.
Tonight, evidence said hackers with ties to Iran may be testing the American infrastructure for vulnerabilities. Officials at a small water utility site in Pennsylvania just outside of Pittsburgh noticed Friday night that a computer that helps control water pressure for 2 townships was malfunctioning. When they rebooted the system, this ominous message, highlighted in red, appeared on the screen, saying, "You have been hacked."
One strategy used by hacking groups is to start small, target a vulnerable location, and then use that to conduct additional cyber attacks in the future.
The group claiming responsibility called themselves Cyber Avengers, saying they were attacking because the water utility used equipment made in Israel.
When I first heard about these attacks at RSA and Black Hat USA 2024, I was blown away by their granularity. I suppose anybody can go into Shodan and look for devices that are connected to water treatment plants that are connected to the internet. But to go that next level, to identify software made in one country or another, that's interesting. You may be thinking about Stuxnet back in 2010. Stuxnet was a joint U.S.-Israel cyber operation that targeted the Siemens System 7 devices and centrifuges in Iran and little else. The very specific Stuxnet payload caused these centrifuges to tear themselves apart, stalling the Iranian government's development of nuclear weapons that could perhaps one day reach Israel. My friend Kim Zetter has the definitive book on the subject called Countdown to Zero Day, and it's available wherever you find good books. In this case, with Ultronics PLCs, the attackers merely left a message on the device HMI. A message, not unlike a political website defacement decades ago. Yet now, there's an attack that's been shown to get down to the device level. So who knows what the next attack might be able to do? Maybe something worse than a political message. And more importantly, since these devices do not collect logs, do not have event viewers, how will future researchers be able to conduct their forensics on the device later? This is a story about a researcher who found a series of devices vulnerable to attack based on their country of origin, and his quest to build new forensic tools in time for Black Hat USA 2024. I'm Robert Famosi. This is Error Code.
I am Noah Moshe, a vulnerability researcher at Clarity Team 82. So at Clarity, we do CPS, meaning we provide cybersecurity over CPS systems and critical infrastructure. In my team specifically, Team 82, we do vulnerability research, where we look at different OT, IoT, ICS, basically medical, that kind of device. And our goal is to find vulnerabilities in this device and responsibly disclose them to the vendor with the hope of protecting our customers and whoever is using this specific product.
You may remember Nam. In episode 21, I interviewed him at last year's Black Hat USA, where he disclosed a significant vulnerability in the Open Platform Communications Universal Architecture, or OPC UA. It's a universal protocol used to synchronize different OT devices. Noam returned to Black Hat USA 2024 to talk about research that he did on the water treatment plant attacks that I've been talking about in the earlier half of this year, in earlier episodes of Error Code.
So basically, earlier this year and the first half, we saw attacks by an APT called Cyber Avengers on an Israeli-made PLCs and HMI combo that is used mainly in water facilities around the world. And in this attack, we saw them targeting specifically US-based devices and Israel-based devices used specifically in water facilities in different, actually smaller water municipalities around the United States. Now, in this attack, their main goal was to spread fear and panic. Basically, they wanted to make sure that the unsuspecting citizen is not able to fully trust his water source, and that way they can basically showcase their elevation and what they got access to, which is attacking critical infrastructure and defacing Unitronics PLCs.
So we've seen targeted attacks before. Certainly Stuxnet comes to mind. They're looking at the MAC address of the device, right? They're looking at the specific software that's being used for the device. Then how are they identifying the origin of the device?
So in this specific attack, we saw that the only targeted devices, affected devices, are internet exposed PLCs, meaning they have some kind of public IP address, meaning that their owner simply forwarded the port, their PCOM, which is the communication protocol Unitronic devices use. And that way, basically, they have a public IP address where they expose their PCOM port. Now, there are services in the internet that constantly scan the entire IP address range and basically build a database of all the available devices that have open ports accessible to the network. Using this list, attackers were able to connect to have the IP address of this target, this Unitronics PLC target, and basically use the vulnerability that was disclosed, which was there was missing an authentication password for the PCOM protocol. They basically used legitimate tools, the engineering workstation that Unitronics, the vendor, built for these devices in order to connect to these attack devices and simply re-download logic to them. Now, in this process, they chose to deface the devices, meaning they changed their HMI screen to showcase a very threatening message. And this was when the attack was took note, and users took note of this attack.
So if a device is connected to the internet, there are various Google-like search engines that can find them.
So there are, not specifically Google, there are many services that constantly scan the IP range, specifically Shodan or Censis, and using this list, these tools, which are publicly available, anyone can query them. They basically compose the list of thousands of different devices located all around the world and chose their targets. And to each target, they connected and basically wrote down the logic and were able to fully control and compromise these devices.
So is targeting by perhaps country of origin, is that a relatively new thing? Or are we just seeing it more prominent because of the political issues going on?
Exactly. This attack was of political motivation. I mean, the motivation was clear. It was just when the war in Israel started. And this was when the APT, which is affiliated to the other side, chose to attack devices, specifically in the United States and Israel, to showcase their political motivation.
So going back 10 to 20 years ago, this would have been like a hacktivist web defacement. And now it's happening on the devices, the HMI.
We called it the modern defacement of ICS. Basically, you re-download logic and change an HMI screen, and that way, you have a physical device that is showcasing your messages. And as it turns out, this APT actually did this very similar attack in the past. This same APT was targeting Israeli e-post services, which are parcel services. And while they were not identified then, we do see a lot of shared assets between these two attacks, specifically different pictures, different fonts, different texts that do point to the same attacker in both cases.
So I know in different utilities there are different models, such as the Purdue model. That model segments a system such that levels 4 and 5 are business and internet connected. Level 3 is generally a DMZ, and levels 0, 1, and 2 reach down to the actual devices themselves. There's a bit of work then required for a remote attacker to change a PLC or to attack it from outside the organization.
So they actually did reach the PLC. The problem was, if we're talking about Purdue module, there was no Purdue module in place here. Instead, the attacked company, the affected companies, simply forwarded their lower level of the PLC devices to the internet, basically allowing anyone with access to these internet scanning services to connect to their PLC and basically alter their physical operation. And this is exactly what we saw when water filtration systems were affected and stopped producing water.
So in this case, the impact was they were actually shutting off these systems.
So far, they believe it did not affect actual water production. However, the process itself was stopped the minute that the attackers reached the Unitronics PLC, because they could have reached, might as well, all the other production in the facility. So while there was no signs of water degradation, it was a possibility, and that's why these different water facilities stopped production and removed their attacked Unitronic device.
So these utilities, they had other methods of defense in depth. In other words, they weren't using, as I said, the Purdue model. They were using other things that could have allowed them to stop and control this before it became a bigger issue.
Yes, and it was not clear that the attackers intend to actually affect water production. More of the messaging and like what we call modern defacement of ICS devices. They did not want to change the logic of the PLC to do something malicious. Instead, they only changed the HMI screen of the PLC to showcase this threatening message.
And around the time of these attacks, there was something else going on in Texas, but that was unrelated, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
The Texas water tower attacks have been linked to a group calling itself Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, and they weren't specifically targeting devices from a particular country. I talk more about those attacks in episode 42. In this case, Noam said the Ultronic Corporation makes PLCs in HMI, and the vendor is Israeli-based. They have older PLCs, known as the Samba and Vision series, that were targeted using the PCOM protocol on serial port TCP 2025-6. In this case, the device almost has no security mechanisms, no encryption, and very weak authentication. Also, evidence of the attack was visible on the HMI screen. However, forensic evidence providing any possible attribution, well, that was a bit harder to extract, if at all.
Now, what we did with these devices, our goal, we wanted to develop a toolset that allows users with affected devices to extract actual forensic evidence and artifacts from these attacked and affected devices, which could use to basically pinpoint and get artifacts from the attackers' computers. So this was the task that we had at end, and this was our goal. And today we are releasing these tools that allow users to basically communicate, connect to the devices, and extract a very wide set of different forensic artifacts from affected devices.
So going back to the beginning part of the year, how did Noam become aware of this? Or how did you even know that something like this was happening?
So, like I've told you, there were two different movements. First of all, users began reporting. So we saw it in many different threat hunting ways. For example, we saw it in social media, in different forums where users come to basically consult with one another. We saw that users began reporting, hey, our devices were hacked, we are affected. After that comes the media coverage, because once again, the goal of the APT in this case was to have as much media coverage as possible. And because it affected water facilities, which are very, very sensitive critical infrastructure, of course, media began covering it. And this was when we decided to be able to help users affected by it and different agencies to be able to better understand the attack and maybe try and identify the attackers.
And we identified that these were mostly smaller water districts in rural areas as opposed to a city?
There is a wide range. Usually the bigger municipalities do not have their critical infrastructure exposed to the internet, although it does happen from time to time, and we do see this misconfiguration. However, I mean, at the end of the day, because we're talking about such big states like the United States, it does affect like thousands and thousands of people, if not more.
And again, there are mitigations for this.
So after the attack, Unitronics pushed a new version that introduces password to PCOM sockets. Now, prior to that, there was no mitigation to this attack whatsoever, other than making sure your devices are not accessible through the internet. Now, of course, this is the first step, and it is super important. You should never leave your devices internet exposed. And while we do see it to this day, it is very bad practice and it introduces such great risk on your networks, even more when we're talking about critical infrastructure like a PLC. Other than that, you can patch to the newest version of the Unitronics Vision, which I believe is 9900, and that way you are able to set up a new PCOM password, which users should do.
So this is a larger question then for device security in general. In the past, access wasn't baked in, so there were a lot of these devices out in the field that were just exposed and they didn't authenticate users, whether they were connected to the internet or not. And that's just by design.
So a lot of the times in the past, when we're talking about OT devices, we're talking about being able to only connect to them using serial connection, meaning I have to be physically connected to these devices in order to interact with them. And that's why we see so many times that devices are not well protected, because in the past, the first protection layer was basically you need to have physical access to the device in order to interact with it. However, now when we're talking about connecting devices to an IP address and to an IP network, more and more times we see that devices are left exposed because the actual protocol implementation behind the scenes still trusts the user so much that it simply does not require authentication or no validation whatsoever. So it is super important to validate that you have proper ACL, network access control, on your devices, and that no unintended actor can access your devices, even more so from the internet, which should never be happening.
So OT devices like this have been out in the field for years, for decades. So I wonder if Noam could speculate as to why so many of these devices in the field are suddenly, A, being connected to the internet, and B, finding themselves under attack.
So the reason it's connected is because it's more convenient when something bad happens. Like if you have a downtime, if your device is down, you want to access it remotely, it does introduce inconvenience if you need to somehow dial in, go physically to these remote sites, and even more when talking about companies with dozens of different remote sites that could be very physically far from one another. However, if I believe that it must be set up that way, that you should never simply expose your device. You must set up some kind of a VPN or some kind of secure way to be able to access your devices remotely. However, still not leave them just with a dangling IP address that way anyone can access these devices.
So we've talked about these water utility attacks and how it crosses all different critical infrastructures. Is Clarity seeing any attacks against, say, energy or manufacturing or any of the other areas that are similar to this?
So we do see an increase in the number of attacks. However, the motivation could be different. It could be, for example, a ransom gang, where their goal is simply to somehow get into the network, encrypt everything, and then demand some kind of money in exchange to unblocking the site. This is very common. We see it like in a lot of different fields. And of course, sometimes we're even talking about not physically not encrypting devices, but simply also like maybe making some data publicly available. This is also super sensitive, super critical. While we do see attacks that do not have like some kind of monetary involvement or monetary requirements, they are more rare because usually the motivation behind the attack need to require something else, like, for example, political, as we can see here.
So with ransomware, is Clarity seeing a decrease in exfiltration, or is it still about the same? Do they want to extract the data, or they just want to hold the systems hostage?
So it depends on the field, because we have so many fields that some of them do require the data to remain confidential. If we're talking about more healthcare perspective, at the end of the day, identifiable information about patients is sensitive, is very sensitive, and should never be disclosed. So that way we do see some kind of data exfiltration where they get a list of all the different patients, and that way they can extract and demand more money for this specific.
I guess I'm thinking about like a manufacturing floor. If you stop the robotic arm or whatever, that alone can cause significant damage in production, and you don't need to do any exfiltration. At that point, the ransomware is just simply for the money.
Exactly. Even stopping a procedure just for a few minutes, at the end of the day, it translates to money. And in most cases, it translates to a lot of money. There is a reason why procedures like physical procedure in manufacturing never stops. It almost never patches, it almost never stops, because at the end of the day, there is money repercussions. And that way, if you even get a denial of service attack on some kind of devices, it could translate to millions and billions of dollars. And that way, there is no need for actual data to be stolen or exfiltrated away. Instead, simply stopping a process or a manufacturing process could be detrimental and cause significant money losses.
I really want to drill down into the forensics part of this investigation. Again, these PLC devices, they don't log events, making it much harder for someone like Noam to do actual forensics. So for that, he had to build his own tool.
Okay, so throughout our process, if we're talking about the Unitronics attack in specific, we discovered that there was almost no tools for forensic evidence extraction from actual PLCs. Now, you see, usually in the past, if we're talking about the big ICS attack, it could be Triton, it could be Stuxnet, the actual forensic evidence that was usually extracted is extracted from some kind of Windows machine. It could be the Windows machine that the attackers used to actually get access to the PLC that was attacked. However, at the end of the day, the forensic evidence was extracted from the IT realm, Windows machine, event logs, stuff like that. However, many times there is no Windows machine. If, for example, we're talking about an Ethernet exposed device, the only Windows machine that connects to it is under the attacker's control, and we have no access to these logs. In that case, we must somehow extract the evidence directly from the PLC. Now, this is actually kind of tough because the PLC or PLC and HMI is an embedded device. It does not have an event viewer, it does not have a GUI, a desktop, event log, stuff like that. In this case, we researched the PCOM protocol, which is the Unitronics protocol to communicate with their devices. And our goal was to try and extract actual forensic evidence directly from the PLC's memory. And this is exactly the tool that we've built and releasing today, which enables users to connect to their devices remotely using our PCOM client. And that way they can do different procedures and get access to different forensic artifacts that could enable them to understand the actual stuff that happened to their affected PLCs. So our tool allows us to extract a wide range of forensic evidence from the PLC. It depends on what exactly happened to the PLC, because if we are able to upload the project from the PLC, meaning get access to the project that is embedded into the PLC, we can extract even more data. However, in the gist of it, we can extract a lot of data about the information about the user's computer, Windows computer that connected to the PLC. This, for example, we can extract the file system path that was used for this project. So this usually means that we can see the file system, the drive letter, even in many cases the username. We can extract the actual username from the computer that was used to connect to the PLC. We can extract different keyboards that are installed on your PLC, and of course exact dates and connection strings used by the user to connect to the PLC. So we're talking about dates down to the second, which, if we're talking about an attack, could be used in correlation to other logs to find an exact time frame of the attack, and also could be used to identify the attacker's time zone. And the connection string could showcase how the attackers get access to our computer, or to our PLC, meaning Was it simply an internet exposed IP address? Was some kind of tunneling was used in the process? This is why these artifacts are so important, because they tell us a lot about the attackers, the possible attackers' ecosystem, and their computer setup.
So the lack of windows, is it specific to these PLCs, or is it anybody that's using the PCOM protocol?
So in this case, we're talking about two series of PLCs made by Unitronics. It is the Vision and the Samba. They are the older version. However, I believe in general, this field is not developed enough. Because if your device, your PLC down in the manufacturing floor is affected, how do you get information out of it? Well, it's not clear. Many times it's not possible, and you will never know what's possible and what's not.
So a bad actor, they'd have to create a very specific attack.
Yeah, basically because we are not talking about, at the end of the day, in order to communicate with different PLCs, each vendor implemented their own proprietary protocol. And that, because of that, if you want to extract forensic evidence from different PLC kinds, versions, and of course, different manufacturers, you need to create different tools for different PLCs lineups. Now, once again, this is also a major setback for this kind of approach. However, if the only thing you have access to is an infected PLC, that's what you have to do. I think the obvious solution for that is standardizing. At the end of the day, just like we have tools and standards for Windows logging and stuff like that, we must build something similar to that in the OT realm. Will it happen? Well, it's tough call, and it's a huge change. However, in the meantime, our goal was, as a community, build a tool set that enables users to extract some forensic evidence from the affected devices.
A lot of these devices are in the field for 10 to 20 years.
Exactly. So, I think what you said is exactly correct. Going forward, I do believe we need to do it. And just like we see the industry evolving and moving towards security in mind, we must move towards logging in mind, meaning some kind of logging mechanism and features on devices. And I hope that manufacturers move to this in the future. In regards to older versions of devices, it is very obvious to say that this was not in mind when they were manufactured and created. In many cases, it is not even possible because the device does not store any forensic evidence on it or some kind of log mechanism. However, this is where we do believe that if we, as a community, build a tool set, build the different functionality, build the different requirement, showcase that there is a requirement, we will move the industry towards the better future.
It was lucky that the manufacturer or vendor in this case was collecting as much rich data as it was.
It's not as if these logs are simply viewable. These are extracted from the PLC's memory or from the actual project file structure. Of course, everything that was extracted is written to it by the manufacturer's code, by the vendor's code. Obviously, we have limitations. For example, the path is only limited to 40 characters and uses Windows short names, so we do have a lot of limitations. For example, some data is irrelevant, is not extracted, is not written by the vendor correctly. However, in this case, we were lucky to find all of this data on the PLC. We believe that while we're lucky, it's not, at the end of the day, it's not as if this data is freely available or extractable from the PLC. And this is the problem. It's not as easy for regular users to get access to it.
So there's a degree of inference going on here. It might be gathering data, but not getting the data that is direct. So you're inferring based on the artifacts that you do see.
At the end of the day, when we documented the PCOM protocol, this is a proprietary protocol, and all the structures and command opcodes or function codes used by the vendor are proprietary, meaning the only documentation that is available is on them. They only have it, and it's not publicly available. There is no documentation. So there is a lot of inferring. However, in the forensic evidence field, it's less of an inferring because at the end of the day, our tool is able to extract the project path, for example, which is like strong is the project path. In regards to the actual protocol or different procedures, there is inferring of what we believe this specific opcode or function code does. And it's up to our interpretation. And we try to document it. And of course, because it is open source, like users are able to try and document other PCOM opcodes and function codes and edit for the community.
And he was working with the vendor, and he approached the vendor, and they were like, we got this information.
We worked with some collaboration to the vendor. We also disclosed a few vulnerabilities to the vendors in both the lineup of devices that were attacked, meaning the Vision lineup, and the newer lineup of devices that replaced the Vision lineup. So we did work in conjunction with the vendor in a few different fields.
And the tool that was created, it works with both?
No, so our tool works with the older series. In the newer series, we have different kind of tool sets. But we did disclose vulnerabilities to the vendor that were fixed for both lineups, because we looked at both lineups from a security perspective.
So why exactly is this important?
I think the main focal point is that we cannot always trust the IT realm to provide us with logs and artifacts. I mean, at the end of the day, when a PLC is attacked, we must have some kind of protection and to be able to extract the evidence somehow. And we cannot trust only being able to extract Windows event logs, for example. And I mean, obviously the first and most important step is network hygiene and never expose your devices, because that way you are mitigating the risk. However, at the end of the day, we need to somehow as a community be able to investigate and understand attacks, not only from the IT realm, but also from the OT realm.
I'd like to thank Noam for talking about his presentation at Black Hat USA 2024. It's important as a researcher to be able to extract critical data from critical PLCs after an attack. By working with the developers and the vendors, he was able to extract what he needed from the PCOM protocol. Hopefully this will pique interest in others to do the same for other devices, and to Noam's point, maybe move toward more standardization in the field. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Join us on Discord. Search for Error Code Podcast to join the server, or go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I have more conversations coming up. I'll have conversations about Secure by Design and more about Operation Volt Typhoon. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.